Create holes and threads. In this video, we'll use hole with a sketch reference, and we'll use thread. In Fusion 360, we want to get started with the supply dataset, Gear Reduction Housing Assembly Detail. We want to start by selecting Gear Housing Assembly, right-clicking, and isolating. We want to isolate it because we want to show the holes in the design, and we want to make sure that we understand whether or not they're the correct sizes. The first thing that we want to do is we want to identify the threaded areas in the housing. If we view this from the front, you can see that we have a smaller area in here and we have the appearance of a thread. Let's go ahead and take a look at Inspect to make sure that these are the correct size. You'll note that the diameter of the upper portion is 6 millimeters, and if we select in the canvas area and we select the diameter of the threaded portion, we can see that it's 5.035 millimeters. We can check a thread chart to make sure that this is the correct size for tapping an M6 hole. You'll also note that this hole is blind. It's going into the housing and not out the backside. But let's take a look at some of the other areas. Note that we don't see any cosmetic threads here, but let's inspect the hole to make sure that it is the right size. This one's exactly 5 millimeters, and the upper portion is exactly 6 millimeters. That's slightly different from the areas that have the cosmetic thread appearance. So let's take a look at the gear housing and see how we can add this. I'm going to hide the front housing as well as the front cover, and I want to activate the back housing. I'm going to focus my attention just on these holes. I'm going to start by creating a sketch. The sketch creation is not strictly required, but it does help speed things up a little bit. We're going to use the Create Point option and place a point at the center of all the holes that are of interest. Once we do that, we can finish the sketch, and we want to go to Create and Hole. Inside of here, the placement option can be single or it can be from sketch. We're going to use the From Sketch option and select all of our sketch points. Don't worry about the preview on the screen as we're going to adjust the size and type of the hole. Now that we have all of them selected, we're going to change the hole type. We're going to set it to tapped, and then we need to select the size. This will be an isometric profile, and we want to go until we find 6 millimeter. We're going to be using an M6 by 1, and note that we only have a single option for the thread class set to 6H. When we do this, it's going to adjust the hole size for us. Note that we can set it to modeled, which will put a physical thread in the hole, or we can have it be cosmetic. When we do this, we should also pay attention to the objects to cut. Right now, we only have the back housing visible, so it's only going to cut through it. But if we had other bodies visible, we'd want to make sure that we're only applying this to the back housing. We can modify other parameters, such as the extent. If we want it to go to the back of the housing, for example, and we want the bottom to be flat instead of tapered, we can set all of those different options so that way we are dealing with a completely threaded hole. We're going to say OK, and now if we use Inspect and we measure the diameter of one of these holes, we'll see that now instead of 5 millimeters, it's 5.035 millimeters. Let's go back to a home view, and let's right-click at the very top level of the assembly and unisolate all. This will bring everything back with the exception of the front housing and front cover. We still have the back housing active, so the opacity of everything else changes, so let's go ahead and activate the top level. The next thing that we want to focus on is this gear on the inside. This is our spur gear, 16 teeth, so I'm going to right-click and isolate that. We want to add a physical thread to this section of the shaft. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that I activate this gear and focus my attention solely on it. Next, from Create, instead of using Hole, we're now going to use a tool called Thread. When we look through here, you'll notice that Thread and Hole are in the same section. Thread can be used on holes that are already created, or we could use Hole at the same time to create not only the hole in the object, but also the physical threads. For creating external threads, however, we want to use the Thread tool. We're going to select the faces and we're going to use the Modeled option. So select Modeled, and for the faces, let's select this external section. I'm going to navigate to a right view and zoom in so I can see the physical threads. We also have some options to modify things like its size, its profile, and the designation. Also note that there is a remember size option if you plan to create multiples. One thing that you will note is that we are seeing a very sharp edge that's being created on the front side. If we turn off the full length option, we can actually change where this is starting, but because we are actually starting on a face that has a taper on the front side, it's not going to allow us to go further than that front edge. So keep in mind that there are some limitations when we're using this full length option. And if we want to have the thread go all the way to the end, we might need to modify some of these parameters. Note that we have a length and an offset value. If we offset it 1 millimeter, note that it's offsetting it from the back side. And the length of this, if we set it to 10.5 millimeters, note that it's not able to create it for the full distance. So for this example, I'm going to select full length, say OK, and I want to take a look at the chamfer that's created on the end of this. I'm going to right click on the chamfer and edit the feature. Holding down the Control or Command key, I'm going to deselect that front edge and say OK. When I do this, it's going to modify that face selection. Now you can see that the thread does come all the way out, and if we need to create a chamfer on the front of it, we can do so with a revolve cut, or we could add the chamfer back if needed. For this example, however, you might not want a physical thread. You might want just a cosmetic appearance. If that's the case, we can always go back in and modify that tool, or we can go into our top level settings and modify the document settings for the thread type. Overall, we can have modeled or cosmetic. If we set everything to cosmetic at the top level, it'll override those settings in each of those individual features. We can always go back to those individual features and we can modify them. But this is a great way for us to also go back and include the chamfer on that front edge without having to worry about the remnant that's left behind from the modeled thread. This can still be manufactured, and in most cases, you aren't going to want the physical threads on the part when you manufacture it. At this point, let's activate the top level, right-click, and unisolate all, go back to a home view, and then let's make sure that we save this design before moving on.